of the role of the chief bike is being prepared for what can go wrong, and in both the men's and the women's race, very little did go wrong. The test event, I had some nasty crashes, and in a crash situation, first of all, you've got to make sure the athlete's welfare, but then secondly, you want to make sure the course is cleared for the athletes coming from behind, or in some cases, if it's a really bad accident and your course is blocked, that you try and have a situation where you clear the course for the athletes on the next lap. At the same time, you're monitoring up to 16 motorbikes, 6 TV camera, stills photographers, medics. So it is a dynamic, busy role, and in the best situation, nothing goes wrong, which for Tokyo this year was pretty good. And but as I said, the test event, we had plenty of incidents. And yeah, sometimes you have to remove cameramen and photographers from the course if they're not following what they're told to do. You do that generally with the assistance of the production team.
The role I did at the Paralympics was Chief Video Review. So my role was to learn how to use the equipment first and foremost. So I was sitting at a booth with 3 monitors and the ability to control what was being able to be seen, choosing from 3 different feeds. So I had a feed of the mount line, the dismount line, the start, pre-transition, and also the broadcast feed. So whatever was going live to TV, I also had access to. So my role was to be reviewing all of the footage all of the time, to look for infractions that might not have been seen on the field of play, and also to review footage of infringements that may have been observed by an official, and see if we had the video footage to back up that penalty, and then be able to operate the equipment to be able to capture and save that footage for head referees to then review and make their calls on penalties. My role of Chief Video Review is one that is not supported by a lot of events. Obviously, the infrastructure and technology required is quite substantial and comes at quite a cost. So it's not a role that is offered all that often. So to prepare for my role, funnily enough, I watched a lot of Triathlon on Triathlon Live just to see what kind of camera angles and what kind of footage was captured. The other thing that was really great, because the Paralympics happened after the Olympics, World Triathlon actually hooked us up with the people who had done our chief roles at the Olympics and allowed us to have a bit of a knowledge exchange around what their experience had been like at Tokyo, and just share the knowledge and share the experience with me. So I felt really well prepared by the time I got to Tokyo.
August 2019, I was invited to the test event, and I was chief bike. So in the build up to that, I had gone over the course as I did again this year on the KMZ files, which is a Google Earth platform, and I was able to see Tokyo from a street level, from the bike course and all the complications. Again, yeah, as I said, 8 world championships and 3 major games in senior positions before that had me pretty well primed. But I was always cognizant that you're never really ready until you get there and you see what happens, as in the weather we had for the women's race and unfortunately that incident with the boat in the men's race. So yeah, be prepared.
Traveling to Tokyo was an experience like no other travel experience I've ever had. When I left home in Brisbane, I went to a deserted airport. When I landed in Sydney, I arrived in a deserted airport and so on. There were 4 passengers on the plane to Tokyo. So the actual act of traveling was really quite eerie and really strange. In order to leave the country, I had to apply to the government for an exemption. But really what I was most concerned about was getting home. There are so few flights returning to Australia at the moment. And there are so many people stranded overseas that really want to return home. So that was my biggest concern. So as it turned out, I was able to be included with the Paralympics Australia travel arrangements. So was included in a quarantine cap and I'm actually now in quarantine with a whole bunch of the Australian Paralympic team right here in Sydney. So that was the main thing for me, was getting my ticket home secured.
Getting to Tokyo, wow, that was a big experience. I was always of the mindset that, you know, with the best intentions and with the selections, myself and LYNDELL could easily just not get there. The government limitations on travel and being able to return back to Australia was a big concern. We were very lucky in as much as that through Miles Stewart and Matt Carroll at the AOC managed to get us there. They, through Border Force, the people at Border Force and the people at Home Affairs, a lot of paperwork, a lot of QR codes to get there and get back. And then Tokyo itself, like, that was when we landed, that's where it all started again. Like, you had to have the correct paperwork. World Tri had prepared us quite well as in their expertise. It was a journey and an experience I probably would not want to have to repeat. It was quite stressful, to the fact that on the day I was leaving Perth, everything was cancelled. I had one missing flight confirmation, and luckily there was a very, very capable crew at Singapore Airlines, who were a partner airline for the Tokyo, and they sorted it in 20 minutes at the airport. They were just amazing, especially as it was my birthday.
My selection for the Paralympics was announced in April 2019, which was quite a while ago now. So in terms of remembering how I felt and what I thought, it's actually really hard to remember, to be honest. I know that when I was first shortlisted by Triathlon Australia amongst the 6 other officials that reached that stage, that was a real honour to me to be named in that list with those 5 other officials. So when that list went to World Triathlon and I ended up being one of the lucky ones to be selected, I'm sure that it was quite a moment. Having said that, when I first started officiating, I never really aspired to officiate at this level. If you had have told me on that very first night that I would end up at the Paralympics, I probably would have stood up and walked out, because that's not what I signed on to do. But as I built my skills and I built my confidence and officiated more and more at the elite level, it's something that I've really aspired to do, and I'm really proud of myself for achieving it.
The Paralympics was very, very, very spiritual. We actually stayed in the village with the athletes, and that was a unique opportunity that very, very few Olympic officials, or even normally Paralympic officials, don't get a chance to do. So I was able to see the athletes in a relaxed environment out of competition, and what stood out to me was the massive difference between the wealthy countries and on the other side, the perceptual third world, second world. But in the end, the competition didn't project that. In Tokyo, the athletes, they were just so happy to be there because of the state the world is in at the moment. So in some ways it was a very different games, as I said, you know, completely different to the Commonwealth Games, and completely different that, you know, to Rio, in as much as the security in Rio was important, but the racing was safe, whereas everything in Tokyo was about testing, separation, but at the same time amazing racing. It was, you know, the athletes were there to race. Yeah, both situations, completely different experiences, but both incredible. So a tale of 2 cities, yes.
The level of officiating is super high. I mean, every time we're on the field of play, we all deliver the best that we can. But at that level, there's just something more that makes you want to be the best that you possibly can. And that's what was the same at the Commonwealth Games and the Paralympic Games. The big difference for me was my role and the location. So at the Commonwealth Games, it was a home games here on the Gold Coast, and I was a chief race official. So my job obviously was to make sure that all of the officials had everything that they needed felt confident, knew where they were going, and were fed, watered. And that was quite a challenging role, but one I took on with real pride, actually, especially on home soil. At the Paralympics, I was on the opposite end. I was a visitor in Japan, and so I really tried to soak up, again, just the cultural experiences that we shared with the national technical officials, and just appreciate the care that went into giving us as visitors a really great experience. Appreciating the cultural differences was probably the biggest difference for me.
Quarantine. Well, there's two types of people. Some people would hate quarantine, and then there's Frank, who absolutely found it lovely. To be placed in a situation where you are in a room on your own, quite a very pleasant 5-star room with great views over the city, and food at the minute when you needed it, and medical checks and welfare checks, and lots of stuff to do. For what's called the AOC had a thing called Quarantine, and where we had Zoom calls, fitness classes, but yeah, the 2 weeks went pretty quickly.
Staying sane in hotel quarantine. Okay, so there were several of the officials from the Paralympic Games who also had to serve hotel quarantine on their return to their home country. So we had a little WhatsApp group and frequent Zoom calls doing exercise classes and jam sessions with Ross Capel from New Zealand playing his guitar, with officials from not only Australia and New Zealand, but also Malaysia and Singapore and China. And there was a whole gang of us that used to get together online all the time and just look out for each other. So that really helped to pass the time. And believe it or not, I exercised. So I managed to complete the equivalent of a 100-kilometer ultra marathon by counting steps and skipping rope. And I challenged myself to do 2 not park runs by running up and down the length of my room. So it is possible to stay pretty productive and occupied in hotel quarantine.
The Saturday after the relay, which was, that was the highlight, the magical relay, as it said, because it was what the sport needed to sell itself going forward in the Olympics. We had a great function put on by the Japanese Triathlon Federation, and the cuisine at that was exceptional.
My favourite meal, what a great question. This might be a surprising answer. Our go-to while we were in Tokyo was the 7-Eleven. We were quite restricted with where we could eat while we were over there. Pretty much there were meals provided for us at the venue. There was a restaurant that we could go to in the hotel, but we were lucky enough to secure the permission to go to the 7-Eleven as well. Let me tell you, 7-Eleven in Japan is a marvel. There was everything from fantastic little udon kits, miso soup in a cup was terrific.
7-Eleven, yeah, lots of good 7-Eleven takeaways. Well, obviously the racing and the interaction with the best athletes in the world are like strongest on my mind, but we had a water ceremony or a ritual that the Japanese officials did with us, and I found that almost was like a cleansing moment, where in the lead up, like for the first 4 to 5 days and the 2 days of the individual competition were quite stressful. On the day after the women's race, we had a sort of a relaxed cultural day with the Japanese officials. I just found that actually put me in a different mindset, and myself and the team moved on from there to the preparation for the first ever relay, which was in itself absolutely fantastic.
In Tokyo. So interestingly enough, something that will stay in my heart forever are the cultural activities that we did with the national technical officials. So because we were living in a bubble over in Tokyo, we weren't allowed to go sightseeing, we weren't allowed to go to any of the other Paralympic events or the opening or closing ceremony or anything like that. We were really restricted to being in our hotel or at the venue. The national technical officials prepared some activities for us to do at the venue, including things like origami, folding, and learning how to write our names in Japanese script. Above and beyond obviously being at the Paralympics, which is the pinnacle of my technical career so far, I think just being there and sharing those experiences is something that I'll always hold on to.